policymakers who would not agree with him. Moscow's grip on the country, very high during the old Soviet days, began to decline at the time of Mikhail Gorbachev, reaching a low point in the late 1990s with Yeltsin in power, only rebounding with the arrival of Vladimir Putin. But that low point is literally one of the most dangerous times in all of human history, because we wondered if the Russian Federation was on the cusp of disintegrating itself into a host of different countries, regions, and power centers, potentially with many of them possessing long-range ICBMs with nuclear warheads on them. What is the extent of the Russian threat to global security and the United States? We can place countries on a threat spectrum. In fact, it's not just the country that goes on the spectrum, it's the country's threats individually that go on the spectrum. On the high end are the nuclear weapons of Russia. It has more than we do. It has more than any other country in the world. It has well over half the world's nuclear warheads. That gives it enormous threat capability. But everything beyond that is relatively low range. Not overly threatening. We're not intimidated by the Russian army. There's not a lot abroad in terms of forces that the Russians can muster that threaten us, threaten regional stability or our allies. So what are American foreign policy options? Well, it begins with a series of questions. Is a new Cold War with Russia inevitable? Well, the answer here is absolutely not. I understand that we don't like Vladimir Putin. We certainly don't like the way he appears to try to push us and our allies around. That does not mean that an historically cold relationship must exist. Do we share common interest? Absolutely. The Russians are not after global instability. They're after Western disunity. Can we force the Russians into submission so that they'll change policy? No, we can't do that. That's a bridge too far. What should be our priority with the Russian Federation? No doubt about it, it's the nuclear weapons. Returning to the table, negotiating in ways that reflect both Moscow's and Washington's strategic interest to head off arms races happening in Asia and to begin to continue the process of lowering nuclear weapons levels. A soft approach? Well, this is a risk-reward calculation. We've been trying to reset relations with Russia for 30 years. The thinking is that it'll lead to cooperation in critical areas. This is what we learned from Henry Kissinger in the early 70s. This was the underlying feature of détente, which led to great breakthroughs in nuclear arms agreements. It could lead to agreements on regional conflicts and maybe even a new era of détente between the United States and the Russian Federation. This is the reward side of a reset. The dangers, however, are significant because if we try to reset and cooperate, it may send a signal to our allies that we're no longer in it for the whole, we're in it individually. We're going to pursue our own policy with the Russians, and that could cede at least some portion of Europe back to the Russians. So the risk-reward of a soft policy has to be taken into account. Sanctions against Russia, always an option, probably preferred to military engagement. We have to keep in mind, however, that if we sanction Russia for its bad acts, it is going to take that out on our European allies. If we're unhappy with Russian behavior in London, poisoning a dissident, or in destabilizing the Syrian conflict, that we economically sanction it, it means the Germans, the Ukrainians, and the French are all going to pay a higher price tag at the pump because Russia is a main provider of oil, gas, and natural gas to Europe, Central, and West. Cybercrime and election meddling are two of the most frustrating aspects of Russian foreign policy these days. The Russians are hurting us, and they have to pay a price for that. Russian cybercriminal activity is directed at American citizens, the U.S. government, the Defense Department, bringing down public networks that oversee our energy in critical regions of the country. And of course, there is the election meddling. I certainly am not going to contend that Russia has determined the outcome of any American election. I don't think that is the case. But I'm absolutely certain the Russians are trying. I mean, they should try. It's their job as a great power to undermine the well-being of more powerful adversaries. But it doesn't mean we have to accept it. The Russians have an enormous bot army. These are little electronic robots, effectively. They take on the persona of a real person, a teenager from Wisconsin, a construction worker in Florida, or a teacher in California on platforms such as Facebook, Twitter, and the like. And they sow discord. They divide the American public. If there is a school shooting, within minutes, the Russians are on social media posing as Americans and trying to get the debate going about gun control versus the Second Amendment. If there's a riot on the Capitol building, then the Russians are going to be on the social networks trying to stoke the fires of patriotism versus security. And even on issues such as horse paste as an alternative to a COVID vaccine, the Russians are going to be there on social media stoking instability in America's open debate process. So how do we respond to these low-level threats? I think we treat cybercrime and election meddling the same, and probably the bot policy of dividing America a little differently. For cybercrime and election meddling, we're going to make it clear to Russia that they are guilty as alleged. We're not going to go through a legal process with them. We've already decided they've been hacking our elections and they've been undermining our society's confidence in its financial system for far too long. A short-term targeted sanction will be applied and then be lifted at the conclusion of 90, 120, or 180 days. We're making it clear to them there is a price to be paid for their cybercrime, blind eye they're turning, and to their election meddling. And if they come back and hit us again, those sanctions will return for twice as long. This is classic tit-for-tat strategy, which is found to be among the most effective ways for adversaries to interact. You punish the adversary for his bad acts, and then you go back to cooperation until they violate again. You're sending the message that their violations have consequences for them. Their behavior on social media platforms, I would put a lot of pressure on the social media industry. It has prioritized profits over American privacy and profits over American integrity for far too long. There need to be some very serious guardrails established for social media giants so that they can weed out the disinformation, the false information, and the Russian and Chinese propaganda that is flooding Facebook, Twitter, Vine, and all of the other social media platforms. This is widely recognized as a problem, but the American response has been very slow. Thank you, as always, for attending this lecture. Stay engaged and make great decisions. Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to Great Decisions 2022. Today we reach the midway point in this 9-lecture masterclass by turning our attention to topic number 5, Myanmar and ASEAN. ASEAN is a political and economic alliance in Southeast Asia. It today faces a great challenge in Myanmar, where a coup d'etat has installed a military dictatorship, and ASEAN has been called upon to address it. But the alliance's challenges are significantly more than internal, because the major power surrounding and to the north of ASEAN is the People's Republic of China. Here you can see Myanmar in red. It is on the western edge of the ASEAN alliance, a very long border to the north and east with China. And this shows us the ASEAN alliance and its 10 member states. China to the north has made significant claims to the South China Sea, well beyond that which is considered normal or acceptable under prevailing international law. and in many ways not only China's military rise of late, but also its extended claims of sovereignty in the South China Sea have served to unify the ASEAN members against it. Before we can consider U.S. foreign policy options relating to Myanmar and ASEAN, we should first consider Myanmar itself, followed by the ASEAN alliance, and then finally take into consideration the various regional dynamics at play as it relates to the crisis in Myanmar. First, we begin with Myanmar. As you can see, it was part of the old British Empire. At the time, the most dominant political force in the world, the United Kingdom in the 19th century and leading into World War I, had vast territorial claims across the international arena, including Burma, which is present-day Myanmar. Myanmar was occupied by the Japanese during World War II, and here you can see on the left-hand side a graph showing the amphibious landing and the penetration into Myanmar by Japanese military forces. There was a concerted Allied effort to take Myanmar back from Japan. The numbers. Myanmar became an independent, recognized nation in 1948. That puts it into the category of newly independent countries. It is roughly the size of the great state of Texas, with 57 million people, the vast majority of which are Burman, and the overwhelming majority in terms of religious belief are Buddhist. The per capita income of $5,142 is not very impressive. This is a poor country. In terms of ethnic groups, the dominant group would be the Burmans. You can see them in areas marked in white. Others, such as the Karen, the Chin, among others, are designated by color on this map. What is not shown are the Rohingya people. They are roughly 1 million in size, although the numbers vary greatly depending on one's source. They are Muslim, which sets them apart. And since 2016, they have been the subject of a genocide. The allegation of genocide, of course, is very significant. It is the targeting with the intent to destroy in whole or in part a person or people based upon any of a number of characteristics, including religion and ethnicity. So when the international community says genocide is happening in Myanmar, this is a serious allegation. As the violence has unfolded, the Rohingya have moved out of state, fled, as you can see from this graph, into neighboring countries, up to Bangladesh, but predominantly to Indonesia and Malaysia, creating a refugee crisis. On a separate note, Myanmar is also troubled by the fact that it is considered the world's meth lab, with significant amounts of illicit drugs being produced in-country and shipped abroad. Let's take a look at the leadership of Myanmar since its independence in 1948. At that point, it was a monarchy. A king was in power. He was assassinated in 1962 when the military made a coup d'etat, taking power and keeping it throughout the Cold War and well into the 21st century. Democracy arrived in Myanmar in 2011. It lasted until 2021, when yet another coup d'etat occurred, returning the country to military leadership. Let's look at the democracy of Myanmar. Most people associate it with one person, Aung San Suu Kyi. She is the recipient of the 1991 Nobel Peace Prize because she was the leader of the resistance movement to the military. She was the face of the resistance, living under house arrest year after year. In 2015, she became the head of government. She could not assume the title of president or prime minister because that was expressly forbidden in the constitutional changes made back in 2011. The military clearly feared her. She has been, however, silent on the Rohingya genocide, at one point stating there's violence on both sides, which is a way of saying that, well, the Rohingya are being targeted, but for just reason. They have exhibited acts of violence, and the state of Myanmar is simply returning that violence upon them. The coup d'etat that took place in 2021 has its origins in the 2020 national election, the results of which were going to be certified in 2021 with a swearing-in ceremony. One day before that ceremony, the military made its move, arresting leaders who had been elected for a variety of offenses, including campaign law violations and violations of COVID measures in Myanmar. Over the course of the next month and a half, over 700 civilians were killed and more than 3,000 were detained. These numbers only increased throughout 2021. The ASEAN Alliance, the organization of states that should play a role in resolving the crisis in Myanmar. You can see from this graph, it is geographically located in Southeast Asia. It was established in 1967. Its membership has nearly doubled to 10 by 2022, and it promotes social, economic, and military cooperation among its member states. Its mission has evolved. Back in 1967, it was limited in membership largely because of its desire to counter neighboring Vietnam, the emerging power in Southeast Asia. It talked a great deal about multinational cooperation on a wide range of issues, which is, of course, its primary focus today as well. But in the mid-1990s, the mission of ASEAN changed to countering not Vietnam, but China, and for that reason, Vietnam was allowed to join the very organization that was created to counter its growth in power. Such is the nature of world politics. Alliances have one common problem relating to internal strife. So here we show a graph of a dominant power. It could be regional or international, and then a handful of smaller nations, each one of them vulnerable should the larger nation decide to invade it. For a matter of deterrence, they bind themselves together in a formal or informal alliance. An attack on one will be considered an attack upon all, and in so doing, they create a balance of power. Other nations, of course, can join if those who are currently members accept them, further strengthening the balance against the larger country. If, however, there is a problem within the alliance, such as Myanmar today, the tendency is to prioritize the original mission of the alliance, countering the large party, as opposed to dealing with problems inside of it. We saw this with NATO in 1974 when Turkey invaded Cyprus, and we're seeing it today with ASEAN addressing the crisis in Myanmar, simply sweeping it under the rug. The violence in Myanmar is significant. Undoubtedly, people are suffering, and the military coup has not been well received by the general public. It has caused people to leave their homes for safety, to flee across the nation, and cross international boundaries. So let's now look at the regional dynamics at play. First, we'll start with ASEAN. How has it responded to the crisis in Myanmar? It issued what it called a 5-point consensus. All of the members of ASEAN agreed on 5 basic points, 3 of which are noteworthy. The call for a cessation of violence, appointment of a special envoy. An envoy is someone selected by a head of state, an organization, or an alliance to be the point person of communication, of contact, and negotiation on a particular issue. We, for example, have special envoys for countries, for regions, or even for themes. Myanmar, of course, a crisis within ASEAN, deserved a special envoy, someone who could speak between Myanmar and the ASEAN alliance. And finally, ASEAN promoted humanitarian assistance to relieve the suffering of the people of Myanmar. There was, however, noteworthy, no call for the release of Aung San Suu Kyi, who is back under house arrest. This is an example of sweeping a problem under the rug. This is not a strong action. This is not collective action with a specific intent, except to be able to publicly claim we're dealing with this issue and we've done all that we can do. Let's look at the influential actors in region. If we were to divide them into three categories, from most important and impacting at the top to least important and impacting at the bottom, ASEAN would go there, along with the United Nations. This is an alliance that has chosen not to get deeply involved and an organization that has very few options at its disposal. In our middle category of moderately influential countries, I would put Japan, the United States, the UK, and the European Union. Their economic power is substantial. If they decided in concert to economically punish those responsible for the coup in Myanmar, it would certainly have a significant impact. But at the very top is Australia. It is a regional power. It is one that has enormous influence in Southeast Asia and with Myanmar. So how has Australia responded to the coup? Forcefully or in a more reserved fashion? It is the latter, acting more like ASEAN in its response, which effectively takes Australia out of the calculation. So let's now look at American foreign policy options. First and foremost, we are a very great distance from Myanmar, more than 8,500 miles. Americans do not prioritize Myanmar. Very few are familiar with the situation that's happening in Southeast Asia, and the United States does not have a long history of investment or engagement in Myanmar. China, on the other hand, shares a common border with Myanmar that's more than 1,300 miles long. So clearly, among the major powers, China is the most influential. Let's take a look then at China. The most influential actor, the leader of that region, a country that is deeply concerned about the anti-China sentiment that is bubbling over in Myanmar. Many in the resistance movement, in the general public, believe that China was behind the 2021 coup d'etat, that it gave a green light because it preferred the military leadership over the elected leadership of Myanmar. There has been a spike in anti-China crime, and that will likely continue, given the sentiment of the people of Myanmar. China is also very concerned about an explosion of COVID on that long common border. After all, if people are out protesting, if they're congregating in large areas, that is a recipe for COVID expansion, and that is not what China wants. And finally, China has to be concerned about the economic corridor that it has established through Myanmar that could be jeopardized by violence in the country. China has tended to prefer elected officials in countries that it deals with. The reason for that is rather straightforward. When China approaches a country about economic engagement, it tends to ask, what do your people need? If it's light rail or a port system, if it's telecommunications, if it's a psychiatric ward or a rum factory. I mean, the whole range of options the Chinese are going to provide it, either through long-term low-interest loans, technical supports, or state-to-state grants. And what the Chinese are doing are building strong relations with publics, with the various members of the public of the countries they engage. And so they're concerned about a coup d'etat that they are going to be blamed for, whether or not they had a role to play in it. Here you can see the economic corridor. It is part of the much larger Chinese design on global economic expansion. It runs through Myanmar on its way to Bangladesh and India. The U.S. relations with Myanmar have risen and fallen, falling during the time of the late military leadership in the early 2000s, rising significantly when democracy arrived in 2011, and then tapering off with the recent coup d'etat. The underlying context of American foreign policy calculations, we don't have any vital interests that are at risk in Myanmar. A military response is extraordinarily unlikely, in part because of the region and our experience in Vietnam, but more importantly because there probably isn't a military solution to Myanmar, and certainly not one that we would pursue. Economic blockades, cyber attacks are probably out, a bit over the top. Targeted economic sanctions make a lot of sense, raising the cost of those who committed the act of the coup. But we're certainly not going to be willing to attach America's reputation to what happens ultimately in Myanmar. We've been burned in this country before. The Obama administration invested a great deal of energy and attention towards Myanmar. You can see Secretary of State Hillary Clinton in-country visit when the military decided that it would allow for a peaceful transition of power. We took away our economic sanctions and upgraded our diplomatic presence in the country. So the Obama administration was invested in turning Myanmar from a military government to a democracy in hopes of aligning with it as part of his pivot towards Asia. We've now been burned to some extent by the 2021 coup. So what exactly is our foreign policy path? Well, we should probably act in concert with other major powers, including the United Kingdom, the European Union, Japan, Australia, perhaps India. India could be an amazingly influential power if it wanted to in Myanmar. To date, it has not indicated a willingness to do so. A lot of risk for India. It is reluctant to attach its reputation to the outcome of this coup d'etat. Targeted economic sanctions, targeted travel sanctions, and targeted social sanctions could all be employed by these major economic powers against those responsible for the military coup. Probably not going to result in any significant change, given that most of those in charge in Burma are deeply invested in their country and in the government that they now are controlling. We will very likely pursue a policy of some suspended aid. We do want to be careful here because much of the aid that we send to Myanmar, even though it's channeled through government offices, makes its way to the people of the country. There is the reality of aid leakage. Anytime that we make a donation to a targeted group within a country, it is going to be distributed by the national government and state institutions. Along the way, people will take a cut. We lose anywhere from 10 to 40% of targeted aid because of this phenomenon of leakage. And while many people argue that we should probably stop donating if the aid is going to be siphoned off into deep pockets, as the most generous country in the world, the United States probably does not want to raise the expectation level so high on aid delivery. There's just a simple reality that it is the cost of doing business. So if we are going to suspend aid, we have to be very careful such that we don't punish the very people of Myanmar who we're trying to assist. We can also dangle some carrots in front of the military leadership of Myanmar. There are things that they want and that we can offer. It would take some direct communication to clearly identify them and then set the conditions for those rewards being offered. I'm not sure at all that we can be willing to offer enough to make any sort of transition back to democracy possible in Myanmar. The violence continues. The protests go on unabated. The body bags, of course, are piling up. We should think about broadening the focus beyond just Myanmar. I mean, that is the crisis. That is the focus of this great decisions topic, but so is the alliance that surrounds it, that includes Myanmar. So let's take a look at the ASEAN alliance and America's relationship with it. In 2021, ASEAN held its annual summit. President Biden was invited and he did attend. He made a $100 million pledge in aid to ASEAN members. This aid was designed to support health care spending,